So I was recently watching this Vice debate panel on YouTube between 10 men talking about masculinity, like toxic masculinity. Is masculinity dying out? Is it a problem that it's dying out? If it is dying out, all these kinds of topics that revolve around the state of manhood today. And usually these panels from Vice are very polarizing and very, like it seems like they pull together individuals who are at vast opposites of a spectrum to create tension and friction. And usually these talks are not productive and it's just like a headache and people spout ignorant stuff and they get mad at somebody for not agreeing with them. I have to say this one felt way more productive in terms of respect for each other's opinions for the most part. But they also brought together some individuals who demonstrated growth in their process of how they used to view masculinity, how they see it now, how they see themselves as a man. So I actually highly recommend it, and I'll post the link in the description box of this video or in the comments. But one thing that struck me was the conversation around dating and the role that a man is supposed to play with dating. Now, of course, as gay men, we have a totally different perspective on this stuff, right? Because it's almost like we don't have the blueprint, right? Like nobody gave us instructions on navigating gay dating because we exist in a world that has taught us we're not even supposed to exist, right? So the traditional gender roles of men and women when it comes to courtship and dating don't really apply to us, right? But one guy in particular was talking during the video about how he gets frustrated feeling the pressure to constantly pay for dates and spending sometimes more than $100 on a date and then never hearing from a girl after the first date and being ghosted. And he was kind of complaining about it, and I felt for him, but I also thought it was silly because I don't think you should pay for a date expecting something. Like it's not a transaction. And I think a lot of people, especially straight men and straight women, have this mindset of like dating is a transaction and dating a woman in particular is transactional. But I feel like you should pay for a date because you want to pay for a date or because it's an expectation that you've set for yourself, but then you just deal with it. Like if you're complaining about spending too much money, then you're probably going on too many dates with women who might not want you, right? Like you should probably be more selective, or I feel like there's ways to deal with that frustration. But it got me thinking about me, and you know, sometimes payment does get awkward with dates, right? Like who covers it? And as I was thinking about it, I realized that when I'm with a guy around my own age, I don't set as many expectations for how they're supposed to handle dating. Particularly when it comes to something like payment. Like I don't apply the same expectations on a guy my age, or especially if he's younger, when it comes to money. But anytime I've gone on a date with a guy, let's say 10 plus years older than me, I have in the back of my mind always thought like he should be paying. And these conversations are really interesting because again, it's about expectations that aren't necessarily communicated. Like I have a friend who's a straight woman who has told me that it doesn't matter how perfect the date is, if a guy doesn't pay for a first date, she's turned off because it tells her that it's not the kind of guy who shares the same sort of traditional views as her of how courtship is supposed to go. And I think this boils down to like, do you want an equal or do you not want an equal? And I think a lot of people don't want an equal, and I think that's their choice. Like they want the man to be the head of the household, right? That traditional old school biblical concept of like one is more dominant, the more dominant alpha presence and so on. But I realized that for me, it's more of an age thing because I associate age with life experience, wealth. Like presumably you should have earned more money in my mind if you're like a decade or so older than me. I'm also thinking more specifically about back when I was in my early to mid 20s and I would go on dates with 40-something-year-old men. At that point, if they've lived twice as long as me, I do personally set more expectations for guys of that age. And years ago, I went on a date with a guy, which is to this day is probably the best first date I've ever had. it was just great. There was chemistry, he was thoughtful, he was smart, and he wanted to meet at a museum. A museum date is an interesting thing because it's one of the rare types of dates where you're paying up front, right? You need to pay for tickets to get into a museum. But most dates, right, restaurant, drinks, whatever, you pay at the end of the date. So by that point, you've already established a certain kind of dynamic. You already know whether you're into somebody or not, which can totally affect whether you even care about something like who pays the bill, depending on how your experience has been with the date itself, right? So I remember that he was in his, I think, early 40s, I was in my mid 20s, and he didn't pay for me, so I paid for myself. And so instantly it was kind of, not a red flag, but a little like, I don't really like that. Like, he invited me here, I can pay for myself. It's not the issue of money itself for me, but the principle of like, And then we hung out at this museum, and the more time you spend, the more your walls come down. And then we grabbed a drink after that, and then we clicked more, and then we grabbed another drink, and he became like a gentleman before my eyes. Like, I remember this was in London. I was visiting London, England, and he lived there. And I remember he was walking me by the river in London, the Thames River, if I remember right. And he was kind of showing me around, playing tour guide, which I think is so sexy when you're visiting a place and somebody plays tour guide with you because they're local. And so the place where we stopped to get a drink, because we were enjoying each other's company so much, he said, "You stay here, I'm gonna go grab us another one." And again, it wasn't about the fact that he's actually paying for me. It's not literally the money aspect, but just the thoughtfulness of like, I want to take care of you. You stay here. I'm gonna go take care of this. And he went in, came back with 2 drinks. And by the way, in the meantime, he left me with his stuff. Like, if I had been a total weirdo, creep, Tinder swindler kind of person, I could have left with his shit, with his phone and whatever else he had left. So I was really charmed by his comfort with me and the trust that he was willing to establish, because what happens is if you do that with somebody, then the other person is more likely to do that with you, right? So he took a chance in that moment on leaving me with his stuff, leaving me by myself, period, during a date, for the sake of like wanting to do something thoughtful and bring me another beverage and get himself a beverage. So it was an amazing date, basically, after that. So it basically developed into a really great dynamic and a really great date. And at a certain point, I don't remember why, but we were talking about compensation. Maybe I actually mentioned that very same thing, that like, wow, I love that you just did that for me. And it's interesting because the date started so differently where, we weren't sure like who covers who. And I remember him telling me in response to that he thought it would be patronizing to pay for me at the museum. And I had never even considered that. But so that's an extra layer that I think is complicated with gay dating, which is that oftentimes both or one of the two guys sees the dynamic as 2 men and therefore doesn't want to imply dominance. But again, all of this boils down to communication, right? Because maybe I do want that, or maybe the other person, whoever it is, does want, again, a relationship that's not totally equal. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think with straight people, that might be an issue at times too. I mean, in more woke, sort of liberal type of cities like a New York City or San Francisco, I'm sure there are women who feel insulted if a man pays as well. I don't think it's the majority. I think most people enjoy when somebody pays for something for them, but I imagine there are women who might get offended by a man paying for a date without even like opening up that conversation. So these themes, I think, nowadays are more difficult to navigate as the world moves away from traditional gender roles, and also just as more women have more independence financially and professionally. I guess all of this boils down to communication, right? If you communicate what you're thinking and in a collaborative way, right? I guess if somebody says, "Hey, I would like to pay for this, I asked you out, is that cool?" I think that already triggers something in somebody's mind, hopefully, of like, oh, this person is partnership minded. They want to communicate. They want to figure stuff out together. That's very sexy. But of course, these topics are not always easy to discuss, especially on a first date when you don't know somebody and you don't want to project, expectations and stuff like that. But I do think the idea of paying for dates is a really interesting part of courtship rituals. I mean, I've met women who expect a guy to pay for everything, and then they're shocked that the guy sees them as like a piece of property. But that's the trade-off. If you start to view yourself as having monetary value, then people are going to see you as an object, right? So again, I think you attract certain things based on those expectations and how you interact with that financial element. What do you guys think about this?